So I'm just going to introduce everyone briefly. Rabbi Kantrowitz teaches for Rhodes Scholar about the Jews of New Mexico. She is the author of Counting the Omer, a Kabbalistic meditation guide, and co-author of One God, Three Paths, which is a prayer book written by a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew. She has degrees in psychology, architecture, and planning, and Jewish studies, in addition to her rabbinic ordination. She's a wife, a mother, and the proud bubby of 3 grandsons. And Rochelle Amado Bortnick, we're going to be hearing a lot more about her and her life during the festival. So I'm just going to briefly say that Rochelle traveled from Dallas to be here with us, and she was born and raised in Izmir in a Ladino-speaking Sephardic family and came to the United States in 1958, and since then has been very active in promoting Sephardic culture and the Ladino language. And if you stay for lunch, we're going to show a beautiful documentary that features Rochelle. And Sonya Loya traveled all the way from Farmington to be with us with her mom. In April, she just passed her test and became a licensed master of social work. Yay. And she is now working on the Navajo Nation in the Four Corners area, and is certified in aromatherapy, EMDR, and Zoko Shindo, which is a Japanese reflexology, and has been in the healing arts since 2005. And she is also an amazing glass artist, and her work is displayed on that table. And if you want to purchase something, please talk to her tomorrow, not on Shabbat. So I'm going to get out of the way. I'll give you guys a 1-minute signal after 5 minutes, and I'll leave it to Rabbi Min to start.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? Yeah. Second of all, welcome. It's bienvenidos a todos. That's very important. Little louder. Okay, so I will think of it as almost a lollipop. Okay, it's good. Okay, when we're talking about this subject, where we are gathered here together, there are all kinds of terms that get used. And I just want to start out by talking about a few of them, and then we will all add our own ideas. And then the 3 of us started to have this wonderful conversation on Zoom. And so what we're hoping is that we continue that conversation, and you can witness it, and then you can join in. So the kind of terms we use are Ashkenazi, Sefardí, Mizrahi. Those are the ones that we hear often. And what are they, and what do they mean? So I'll say something radical, which is that I think those categories are only current cultural groupings, that they really are not reflecting the complexity of our history. Because when we think about it, the Babylonian expulsion, which happened 586 BCE, was the first time that this group of Yehudim were scattered. And some of us went north and ended up perhaps in a place like Turkey. Fast forward a whole bunch of generations and a whole bunch of other countries in between. Some of us went south and ended up perhaps in India, perhaps in China, perhaps in Spain, in Portugal, all across Europe, in England. And our story continues by having us be often not of our own choosing, moving from one place to another, from one cultural group to another, from one language group to another. And with each of those expulsions and recommitments and reassimilations, we changed our language changed, our cultural associations changed, and our associations with who we are, how we identify ourselves changed as well. I will say for me, I was brought up knowing that I was Ashkenazi. And that was the group of people who came over from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, all of Eastern Europe, largely the end of the 1800s, after things got bad for the millions of Jews that were living there before the Holocaust. And then 6 million of us then were killed tragically in the Holocaust. The major group of American Jews today are the result of those people who came at that point. So to the point that in America people say you're Jewish, the assumption is that you're Ashkenazi. The assumption is that when it comes to Hanukkah, you're going to eat latkes. The assumption is that if you have a religious language, it's going to be Yiddish. And the issue is that that's not true for many, many people. The Sephardim, who were actually the first to come to America and were much more highly educated and highly cultured than the Ashkenazim that came from these little poverty-stricken shtetl in Russia. I gotta put a little Yiddish in there since I know some, right? They were undereducated. My grandmother was never taught to read or write. And so if you want to have an example of drastic cultural difference between Sephardim, who were the flowering of Hebrew poetry and philosophy, and the inspiration for much of what developed later, that whole tradition, that whole history, has been, buried to some extent. And so what happens is, on Hanukkah, no latkes, because, potatoes don't grow very well in Spain. So you eat whatever's less expensive. And so you make fried dough and wonderful donuts. And your language is not the Hebrew via German, via Polish, via who knows what else that became Yiddish, but rather the Spanish influenced by Portuguese, Turkish, Italian, and a whole bunch of other languages that has become Ladino. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rochelle, who can continue this long and complex story.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that wonderful introduction. Really, that sort of laid the groundwork for us. Thank you. I want to begin by saying that the word Sefarad means Spain in Hebrew. And so it seems that our Spanish Jewish ancestors had been there since the big dispersion of 70 AD in Spain. And then they slowly continued to come after that. And so there was a very large community in Spain. And as you mentioned, especially under Moorish or Arab rule in the 10th to the 12th centuries, we had a flowering of religious and literary culture in Spain. So then, as the Reconquista, not to go into that history, but it's relevant here, happened and the Christians took over, the last bastion of Muslim rule was Granada. And in March of 1492, they conquered Granada also and took over the king and queen, known as the Catholic kings, the Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, came to that to the Gran Alhambra Castle, some of you may have seen, and decided they were now, the whole country had to be Catholic and nobody else can be. And so that was the famous expulsion edict that was signed actually on the 31st of March, is a date to remember, of 1492, and Jews had to leave. Anybody who did not accept conversion into Christianity had to leave. And people like me in the Ottoman Empire, from the old Ottoman Empire, traced their ancestry to that event in 1492. And the expulsion gave us 3 months to leave. You know that we speak about our ancestors as us. We were there.
Yes.
And so then they extended it a little bit, and it said that it was so close to Tisha B'Av that they had to leave just before Tisha B'Av. So what could they take with them? They were very restricted as to what they could take with them. But the main thing they took was their language and their religion, because my ancestors were the ones that refused to convert. Now, it's very interesting, you mentioned about the first Sephardic people in America, in North America. I didn't know that there were what we call now Western Sephardim. And those, I discovered that after I arrived here, that indeed the first Sephardic people in America were those that had come from Spain and then Portugal. That's a long story, but from Portugal to Recife in Brazil, which belonged to Portugal, and there was no Inquisition there. So they came to Recife in Brazil, and then the Recife belonged to Holland. There was no Inquisition. So we erase what I just said. Recife was the one place in Portugal that did not belong to, the one place in South America in Brazil that did not belong to Portugal. And so they came there, yes. Okay, 1 minute. So today, let me go back only to when the immigrants from the old Ottoman Empire started to come to the New World. They met for the first time these Sephardic people who had been here from 1654, to be exact, and were. And so there was a cultural difference because we were coming from the East with a different culture, and there's a story about whether or not they helped, and there have been books about that. So that's, I'll leave it at that and continue. I think the idea of Western Sephardim leads to Sonya's story.
Thank you, Raquelita. Amor, Rabbi Min, mi otra amor. The village of Loya, the Loyas, in the northern province of Spain, in Navarra, and it lies upon the border of France and Spain. As of 1950, the village of Loya has been vacated. It's an empty village now. Interestingly, my dad's oral history was that 3 brothers left Spain. He didn't know when, and they ended up in the area of Chihuahua. And they had either a land grant or, if they had converted, maybe, or they purchased land in the Chihuahua area, and they had a ranch. My grandfather came from those three, one of those three brothers. We're still trying to, connect the dots. When is the interesting part? Because I don't know. I have uncles that were dressed in World War, no, it was before World War I, wasn't it, Mom? It was the Civil War of my Kovos side of the family. Many of the brothers were dressed in uniform. And so I know that part of that family has been here for a while, probably came with the first 7 voyages, possibly with the Oñate voyages. And my grandfather immigrated with his sister and his mother during the Mexican War. My great-grandfather was a federale. He worked as a sheriff and was in the war and never made it back. So my grandfather earned his citizenship here in the United States by being in World War II. And my mother's brothers, my mother's side of the family, had been here for a while. We don't know exactly when. I know that my great-grandmother immigrated from Spain through New York and ended up in Southwest Texas. How that happened? We're still trying to figure it out. Interestingly enough, I believe that some of my family, my dad's immediate family, were crypto Jews. And let me explain that. The word crypto comes from the word cryptic, hidden, secret, enigma. And my mom's family, very, very secretive. My grandmother would get angry and not talk about the family. But she is the one that taught my mom how to check eggs for blood, and I had to read that in the Shulchan Aruch. So it was almost as if right before this is dying out with my father, I was drawn to Judaism. I am not a crypto Jew, and that has surprised many communities that I've spoken at and shared my story. They're all like, "You're not a crypto Jew," because that seemed to be the term, the easy term. They're secret Jews. But we also had conversos in my family that were willing. My mother's mom, we just thought Granny was a very holy Catholic because she prayed 3 times a day. She covered her head. She was very strict about foods, made the best donuts in the world in the wintertime. And so the clues have been there. My mom's family, one day she was telling me about the day that her grandmother was dying, and they went and got the family priest. And that was a wake-up call for me because I'd been studying with Stan, and he was my mentor. Most of you know Stan Horties. And he was sharing timelines with me. The possibilities of when the Loya families immigrated. And anyway, my mom was just randomly telling me the story about her grandmother's, the day she was dying. She reminded them to be sure and face her feet towards the east. And a Catholic priest in converso families was kind of a known. They would use the oldest son. He was a Lopez. The last name was Lopez. And he came to do special prayers for my great-grandmother. My mom was 17. She doesn't really remember what the special prayers were. They were just special prayers. And my great-grandmother asked, "Be sure you put my feet to the east." So we are the remnants. I say to people, I am Jewish. I went through conversion in 2005. And my ancestors, my father for sure was a crypto Jew. He hid his whole life since the time he was 6. He was told to keep the family secret. My mother's mother didn't say a word and wouldn't say a word. And so we have that converso, people willingly to convert. Then we have the cryptos in the family that were not willing to talk about it and to keep their identity secret. And then we have the B'nai Anusim. And Anusim is a Hebrew word. The root of that is to be raped, forced or coerced. And so I identify as a bat anus. I'm a daughter of one who was forced to keep the secrets. I was never a crypto Jew. I wasn't hiding anything. I was looking for the right answers, and I found them during my journey. And you know, Rachel, and I shared this with Rachel and Rabbi Min, when I was in Jerusalem back in 2011 organizing a conference and a tour, an Anusim conference and tour, I visited the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in the Old City. And the next week, I went to the Italian synagogue. And so there's this interesting crossover of what is East and West. Can you share that with us?
Yes, I want to, I think I left something sort of hanging, and that is this Recife story, that when the Portuguese reconquered that city in Brazil, that's when the first Jews left. They had gone there, they were originally conversos. They didn't leave in 1492. They were looking for a place to go where they could just be Jews. And so because of the Dutch India Company and all this kind of thing, they came to Recife where they could be openly Jewish because it was under Holland. But then the Portuguese came, took them, and then they had to leave again. So, by the way, that first synagogue is supposed to be there. I haven't seen it if you go to Brazil. So that's how come they came to New Amsterdam, which became New York. Mm-hmm. So that's how they ended up to be the first ones here. And so our history is really so intertwined. Mm-hmm. the more you think, I found out. Ooh, excuse me.
I have some cough drops. My mom will bring some.
I just need some water. This climate is
dry.
We lived in Israel for 2 years, my husband and I. We intended to stay, but we didn't anyway. And there I found out that anybody who wasn't Ashkenazi was called Sephardic. And so then I found out how complicated things are, because when people left Spain or Portugal later, you know, it's a very mixed up story, because not everybody left in 1492.
No.
Lots of people, I think, naturally said, oh, this will pass too. We've gone through worse before. You know, there were pogroms in 1391 that were terrible. And so they said, this will pass and, you know, we'll be okay. And they saw, then the Inquisition came, and that was horrible. And so many continued to go. As a matter of fact, the Amado side of my family, we know, were conversos, because they came to the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century, not that long ago, from Bayonne in France, which was another place where the formerly conversos had settled. So it's all intertwined. So going back to Israel and the fact that they were calling everybody who wasn't Ashkenazic, Sephardic, the term Mizrahi came later. But even there, I discovered there are overlaps, because when we lived in St. Louis, Missouri, I organized a Sephardi Kala in our synagogue. It was the first time that I really came out of my shell and started talking about what is Sephardic. The rabbi said, oh, I will invite somebody I know who in St. Louis who is Sephardic. And their name was wonderfully Sephardic. She was Luna, he was Eli, their last name was Cavasso, but they were from Syria. And they spoke Arabic at home and had never heard of Ladino or Spanish or anything. They knew that their ancestors must have been from Spain because they had Spanish last names. But So what are they? Mizrahi, which is the term that is being used now, which for people who are not of Spanish, Ladino-speaking communities, but are from the East or from North Africa, Morocco, and so on. So there's a lot of intertwining of these terms, and it's not really right to draw these lines, and not to mention the fact that many of the Sephardic expelled people went north to your place.
Right. Right. I mean, right. So those people who left Spain in 1492 under pressure, some of them went north, and as Rochelle said, Holland was a safe place there, and then it got to be not so safe there in Northern Europe, and so they got pushed east into Germany, into Poland, into Ukraine, into Russia. Fast forward 4 generations. Are you Ashkenazi? What are you? And to complicate matters even further, Rochelle mentioned 1391, these huge pogroms that happened in Spain. And that was really only 50 years after the Black Plague. And the Black Plague just decimated the population. And Jews were blamed because they were not dying at the same rate as Christians were dying. So,
Because we were cleaner.
Because, yes, hygiene practices will do it every time. And, and so what happens, they say, okay, we're dying, you're not, it must be your fault, you're poisoning the wells, etc. So there were these pogroms in 1391, and tens of thousands of Jews left, quote, voluntarily, and many of them went to Italy.
Sure.
And so then we have this whole group of people who are Italian Jews. Are they Romani? Are they Mizrahi? Are they Sefardí? Are they Jewish?
Italian?
They're Italian. And I remember going to services once in Florence, and the prayer book is in Italian and Hebrew, and many of the rituals during a Saturday morning service were neither Ashkenazi, nor American, nor Sephardi, because there was this new subculture of us as a dispersed people developing a local subculture wherever we happen to land.
Exactly. You've really touched on another subject, and that is the Romagnot Jews.
I was just fixing
The Romagnot Jews in the Ottoman Empire, when the Sephardic people began arriving, and by the way, they didn't arrive some arrived in 1492, but they continued coming from different places where either they were expelled again, or anyway, or they had converted, like my one side of the ancestry, and had to go somewhere else, and then came to the Ottoman Empire. But they found Jews there who had never gone very far from Jerusalem. They had settled in what later became Ottoman lands, but they were Greek-speaking, the ancient Greek that lived in that area. And so there is this group of Jewish people that the Sephardic Jews found that were Greek-speaking Romagnot Jews. They hadn't gone very far from Jerusalem. As it happens, the Sephardic arrivals were so great in number, and their culture was so superior, if I may say that, to those that they found, that mostly because of the numbers. In most places, these Romagnot Jews became Sephardized. They became Ladino-speaking and so on. And if you're interested in how come we were able to keep the language for 500 years, ask us later. But there were some cities where they were in the majority, like in Yanina in Greece. And the only Romagnot synagogue outside of Israel is outside of Greece, is in New York. There is a Greek-Jewish, it's called Kehila Kedusha Yanina in the Lower East Side that exists and is the oldest Romaniot and the only Romaniot synagogue in the United States. So there are still Romaniot people who don't consider themselves Sephardic, even though they come from the same area.
Another term that we haven't mentioned up here is Marano. And Marano is, often appears even in scholarly circles, even though it's a disparaging term.
Yes.
It used to be used because people didn't know what to call these people, so they called them Maranos, which really means pig or unclean. And, another term that we haven't talked about is Old Christian and New Christian. When after Ferdinand and Isabella took over and achieved their dream of one country, one religion, one way of doing things, and it's mine, it's a simplified version of their goal, they required that everyone be Catholic, and a lot of people converted. Was that a conversion of expediency, of convenience?
Right.
Was that a conversion because otherwise you were going to be killed or lose your means of economic support? Doesn't matter. Many, many people converted, but they were still looked upon with suspicion by the old Christians, people who had been Catholic for a while. So the Spanish government actually put into effect this distinguishment, whatever, between old Christians who had been Christian for many generations and new Christians, and they had this concept of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, and you had to be 4 generations of Catholic for you to be considered eligible for certain professions, eligible to maybe marry off your children to one of their children. So being a new Christian supposedly was a way to stay safe, but in fact...
I wonder where the Nazis got their idea.
I wonder, right.
Right.
Same idea, exactly.
Because the Inquisition was ending in this state when this state became a state for the Union in 1912. The Inquisition had the Holy Office of the Inquisition no longer had power here, but it didn't end in Mexico. They've recently changed it in the last 10 years to the Holy Office. So when you're looking at how long the Inquisition lasted, the Holocaust was starting. So it was the Inquisition fired the Holocaust. As it was ending, the Holocaust was starting.
Yeah, we tend to think that the Inquisition is something that happened far away in Spain. But in fact, there were 2 major Inquisition offices, one in Mexico City and one in Lima, Peru.
Yes.
Right.
Major Inquisition. And when we think about how do people end up in New Mexico, you want to get as far away as you possibly can.
Did you know there was one in Goa, in India?
No.
Yes, there was an office of the Inquisition in Goa, in India. The Spaniards,
Well, the Portuguese, didn't they?
the Portuguese. The Portuguese, it was a Portuguese colony. And it was just as brutal as any.
There's a great book that I've been reading. It's called Empire and Trade. It's Garcia de Horta, who was the physician. He was a converso. His family had gone from Spain to Portugal, and they believe that part of them, that family, practiced crypto-Judaism, and he was the doctor for King Zhao. And he ended up in India, and he researched all the spices and herbs and foods and fruits that were food, medicine, or just food. And the Catholic Church, he was protected, his family was protected until he passed away. And when he was passed away, they came after his family with a vengeance, and part of them lived in India. And 80 years after his death, they interned his bones and burned his bones at the stake and began to destroy all his medical records. So what was left has been compiled academically now. So it was pretty brutal.
Speaking of books, another one that's really interesting is Taste of Honey, which is a collection of recipes that came from going through all of the detailed Inquisition records. What were people accused of? What were their lives like? And David Gitlitz, who was one of the co-authors of that book, collected recipes and published them. All of the recipes in this book only used ingredients that would have been available at that time. And each of the recipes is accompanied with the stories from the Inquisition records of what these people were accused of, and often what occurred to them, what happened to them.
Jobs.
Yeah.
Because there's another great book that's probably not being published anymore. It's, let's see, The Glassmakers, An Odyssey of the Jews, the First 3,000 Years by Samuel Kornunsky. And a friend of mine gave me that back in early 2000s, right when I ran across the records, the Inquisition records of a man named Juan Robles. Come to find out, my maternal great-grandmother's name was Robles Salcido Lopez. And Juan was burned at the stake. His mother had converted and tried to get him to come from Morocco. He went to Morocco. And the glassmakers were the Jews until the Inquisition started in Spain. And that's how they traced us as well, was by our trades. So it's pretty interesting when you start looking back just a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, because those troubles started in 1391. People were converting.
We have about 10, 15 minutes left. Do you want to take questions?
Yes, please.
Questions, yes.
Wait a second. If you have a question, please go up to that mic so that the people on Zoom can hear you. And we'll be able to hear you better too. So if you're dying to ask a question, you can line up.
Thank you so much. Look at this. Thank you so much.
I was trying to get a handle on the timeline, the chronology of this. I think, Rachel, you mentioned the year 1564.
1654.
1654, I transposed those numbers. That's rather late, and that referred to the Sephardim who went to Recife. Okay. Did the Dutch have any other outposts in Brazil, or just Recife?
It seems, it was only Recife.
Okay. Also, if Jews left Spain and crossed the border into Portugal starting 1492, the Portuguese then got their idea to continue this Inquisition stuff. I'm thinking 1512 that began, is that correct?
For what?
Portugal
1510.
beginning an Inquisition against Jews.
Yes.
I'm thinking
that's right.
1512.
They were able to be freely Jewish for a while in Portugal.
Not for very long.
Right.
No,
So
it was
15
3 or 4 years before the King of Portugal said, I want one of my children to marry one of Ferdinand and Isabella's children, and in order for them to bless the marriage, Ferdinand and Isabella said, you have to get rid of your Jews too, and so he did. So it was 4 years.
All right. Well,
Yeah, but that was the expulsion from Portugal. That was the expulsion. We have to make a distinction between the expulsion and the Inquisition, because the expulsion happened in 1492 from Spain and in 1506 from Portugal.
Oh, 15, that's earlier than I said. Yeah. Okay.
1496 from Portugal. It was only 5 years later. And that was the story of the marriage business, that Isabella's daughter, also named Isabella, married the king of Portugal, And so the condition was that they also had to get rid of the Jews.
So in Spain, essentially, Isabella and Ferdinand said, okay, you Moors, you Jews, you can leave, you can stay if you become Catholic, or we'll kill you.
Right.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't working.
Well, you can stay, we'll kill you if you stay Jewish, or if you stay.
But in Portugal, it was just, okay, we don't want you, go.
Right, right.
And-
Actually,
but they
that's right, but they couldn't leave. That was the most tragic thing.
Oh.
They expelled them, and there was no way for them to leave. And there were forced conversions, especially in Portugal.
Okay.
That because the king didn't want them to leave, they wanted them to stay. So he didn't provide any means for them to leave. In fact, he prevented them from leaving.
Counterproductive.
So that's why later on, all these people looked for ways to, and when they established the Inquisition, then they looked for ways of getting out of there. And when Holland became independent, then they started going there, or that area, because borders keep changing. Yeah. So anything else?
Hopefully a quick question, and I don't know if you can answer, but the three of you would be my best bet. Reading about Shakespeare's time in England, there was an expulsion. And so that would have been late 1400s, early 1500s. And I can't figure out where those Jews went, or what we would call them. English Jews? I don't know.
Yeah.
So any information or book, if you have a book, that would be great.
There's a book called Rembrandt's Jew or something like that. I can tell you later. Yeah, it's fictionalized, but it's based on fact. Because, Rembrandt painted
So-
Jewish figures because there were so many there.
1290 is the date that I have in my head for when Jews were expelled from England.
Oh, so earlier than I thought.
Yes, much
Earlier than I
earlier.
thought.
Yes, they
So
were
it's much earlier.
Jews had been expelled from France. They had been expelled from England. It wasn't the first expulsion, but it was the most dramatic expulsion because they were a real part of the society. They had been there for what, 800 years since 70? No, what am I talking about? From 70, it's over 1,000 years.
And
do the
not only
math.
that, but they were every town in Spain. It wasn't like they were only concentrated in major,
No.
city centers. Every town. There's an amazing map I've seen for all these little dots, Jews
Red
living
de Juderia,
everywhere.
as they call it.
And according to the Edict of Expulsion, it was illegal to be Jewish in any Christian territory at all. That included the ships. It was illegal to be Jewish and be on a ship. It was, and that was not. That they didn't get rid of that law till what, 1960 or something. So when I went to Spain in the early 60s, that law was still on the books. It was illegal for me to be there.
The expulsion was de facto lifted, the edict, in 1964. But it has really never been crossed out, the edict of expulsion, but it's not in effect. All about how now they they are giving citizenship to people who were expelled and their descendants and so on.
We have time for probably one more question if anybody else has a question. Please go to the mic.
I have a couple of questions. One, I had recently read a book about crypto Jews in New Mexico and the fact that in Mexico and New Mexico, either firstborn sons or sons of conversos often became priests.
Right.
And I'm just wondering about that. It's such a dramatic change. And what the thinking was this to protect the family?
Yes, the community.
The community.
Because you have to remember that people migrated in groups, okay? That
Yeah.
we didn't always migrate alone. So when we're migrating in groups, you have families that can marry within families. My mother's, my dad's grandmother wanted my mom's mom to marry my grandfather, Loya, Carlos Loya. And so my grandmother was a Lopez. So they knew who they were, okay? The Covos side of my family, that great-grandmother lived across the street from the Catholic Church in Alpine, gave them money, but never stepped foot. And that was the grandmother that raised my dad when my uncles came back from World War II and were liberating the camps. One of my uncles told my grandmother, it's still not safe to be a Jew. My dad was born in 38. My parents were both born in 38. And my dad was 6 when he was sworn to the secrecy. And to
So
the
there
day
was-
he died, he passed not quite 2 years ago. He didn't tell any of his siblings. He told me, my mom, and one of my cousins. And
So
that was it.
this living in fear
Yes.
that you're saying?
Yes.
Was
It was
it
just
all-
security.
Right.
You
And
know.
if you say, listen, you can't possibly suspect me of being Jewish or my family of being Jewish. See, my oldest son is a priest. You know,
My
and
cousin's a
even
priest,
better,
yeah.
be an inquisitor. How do the inquisitors know what to look for? Because they used to be Jews.
Was there ever an intention also of being on the inside of the Catholic Church
Absolutely.
and
They had to
knowing what was
watch.
going on? Yes. Okay, and my second question has to do with, does anybody know about Moors immigrating, coming with the Spanish to the New World?
They were not expelled until about 10 years later, but all the Moors were expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella as well.
Yes, but-
Later. And are there Islamic crypto Muslims? Yes.
Yes.
Did they
Yes.
immigrate
And
to
there
the,
are
to the
some that return to
West?
To
Islam
Israel.
now.
Yeah, some live in Israel now.
Were they conversos
Muslim.
who came with the Spanish at all?
Moors, we don't know. We do know about Jewish conversos.
Okay, thank you.
So Rabbi Hollander, whose family went from Spain to Holland, they maintain that name. He now he's been in Israel since, I think, the 60s. And he is working with communities in Israel that are Muslim, secretly Jews. They have artifacts because some of their families converted. So you have to remember, the fight was between the Catholics and the Moors. Jews got caught in the middle. So Jews, some of them converted to Islam and some of them converted to Catholicism. And he's now working with those communities secretly in Israel. And they still have artifacts.
There's a lot more to say, but it's time.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. And
Thank you.